Thank you guys for being here. Very excited to talk to these filmmakers about Mexican cinema. We have the director of Summer White, Blanco de Verano, Rodrigo Ruiz Patterson. The director of Identifying Features, Fernanda Valadez. The producer of Vivos, Elena Fortes. And the producer of I Carry You With Me, Edher Campos. Thank you guys for joining us. I'm sure you guys
Thank you, Carlos.
Nervous to premiere your films here and watch other amazing films. I wanted to start by asking each of you if you could recommend the audience a Mexican film from the past few years that you really enjoy and that you think people should see, whatever that may be, and why that film connected with you. If you want to start.
Yeah, I would say two films. The first one would be a documentary. I don't know the translation in English, but it's called more or less, it will be Intimities or Confessions Between Shakespeare and Victor Hugo. It's a film about how the grandmother's director had a relationship with this serial killer in Mexico City. It's called Shakespeare and Victor Hugo because it's in a neighborhood in Mexico that the streets are called like that, and they used to live there, and they rent the rooftop room to this guy. That would be one. And a fiction dramatic film would be The Amazing Catfish from Claudia St. Luz, a fiction from 2013. I think that the characters are really great, and you can really connect with them and with their small conflicts. That will be my two recommendations.
I would definitely recommend a film that I had the honor to produce, which is The Darkest Days of Us, and it's by Astrid Rondero, who is here. And it's a film that really, I believe, expressed my vision of being a woman struggling to do something that's unexpected for women. It's a film about memory, but also about women dealing with power.
So I'm going to continue the women filmmaking recommendations, but I would say Las Niñas Bien, The Good Girls by Alejandra Marquez, which is a film that was made, I think, entirely by women. It's based on a book that was very popular in the 90s, but it's very focused on the inner landscapes of the characters and very experimental in its form. And I would also recommend a documentary, The Night Watchman by Natalia Almada. It follows kind of the daily life of a cemetery as it starts getting packed, basically, of dead narcos. But it's looked at from the perspective of the night watchman of the cemetery and the workers building the tombstones.
Well, she took first the movie, but I also would recommend The Good Girls, Las Niñas Bien, that actually the producer is here sitting, because it's an exquisite movie and a great performance, and it's a very contemporary movie for the way it's the portrait of a society in the 80s in Mexico, and yeah, I was thinking about that movie, The Good Girl.
So since we want to sort of get into the energy of, that's in Mexico, sort of like this moment that the cinema of the country is experiencing, I wanted to start asking Rodrigo and Fernanda, 10 years ago, where were you in terms of like your filmmaking path, and how, what was the landscape back then, and how has it changed now that you've debuted in your first feature here today, or this week?
Well, 10 years ago, I went to the film school really late, so I was just beginning film school, and at that time we were barely making more than 20 to 40 films a year. Now we're making 200. So the landscape has changed a lot because we're producing so much more. I believe now that our challenge is to find distribution, because we produce, but then those films don't get to the screen. So I believe that's kind of the landscape now.
Yeah, sure. I was getting to film school as well. Actually, we're from the same film school with 2 years of difference. So I was getting into film school. I think, in my opinion, something that was really important at least from my point of view at that point, was that that year, the day I made my admission exam to film school, it was this year that a lot of Mexican films were in the Oscars. Well, not Mexican films, but by Mexican directors. It was the year that Babylon, Children of Men, and Pan's Labyrinth were nominated for several Oscars. So that made a lot of noise in Mexico in terms of people wanting to make cinema. I think another thing that was really important, contributed for the growing of Mexican cinema, was as well that we were the last generation that we shoot movies on film, and then the video started, so it's easier to make films. I think it was a boom for documentary as well. So I think that was really, really, really important for the production of more and more films. And statistically, from 10 years from now, like every year we produce more films than the last year, you know? And of course, I think the same as Fernanda. The problem in Mexican cinema is the distribution, not the production now.
And for you, Elena and Edher, who you've been in the game for a while now, producing films and in the industry, was there sort of a tipping point in the last 2 decades that you felt there was a significant change in, you know, more films being produced, diversification of the films being produced in Mexico? And is there a reason that you could, you know, pinpoint as to why that happened?
I would say it's a combination of factors. Like, for one, I think the popularity of Mexican filmmakers outside, for sure. I was in the festival world before with Ambulante, and when Ambulante started in 2006, there were probably about 6 film festivals in Mexico, and now there are 155. So there's, you know, even though distribution is complicated, there are definitely a lot of different outlets to be able to see films, and then technology-wise, you know, with the digital and also, you know, streaming platforms coming in are definitely changing the film landscape. But I think one really important was the Mexican film tax incentive, which funds a lot of the Mexican films. So, you know, companies can deduct taxes if they invest in Mexican films, and you can get up to $1 million per film. So most films in Mexico, or a lot of them, Rodrigo knows the specific statistics, but most of them are being funded by state funds. So that was a huge...
Actually, 53%.
53%, not that many. But there was definitely a spike in production ever since the tax incentive was in place. Mm-hmm.
Edher, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, it was difficult because 10 years ago, like, the tax incentive was more focused for commercial movies. So independent cinema was really, really looking to get finance in a way to that companies who give the taxes can really believe in different stories that was not comedy or horror. So I remember back days, I was producing my first movie that was Leap Year, that won in Cannes, and also Amat Escalante was presenting Ellie. So these 2 movies was very different in a way of independent, and I think it was like a first wave that was like coming up for like new film directors, and these 2 movies was like looking to make the production not getting tax incentives, because also Ellie was talking about like narcos and stuff, so it was like probably like a bad image for Mexico. So I don't know, that I found that interesting, that the tax incentive was working, but also like the independent cinema was looking the way to get financed.
I wanted to go back to what Rodrigo was saying about, you know, these 3 filmmakers that have now become sort of like the holy trinity of Mexican cinema. You know, Guillermo del Toro, Alfonso Cuarón, and Iñárritu, even though they don't, you know, particularly make Mexican films anymore. Does that weigh on Mexican cinema? Is it, you know, how helpful is that you know, that people associate, particularly outside of Mexico, Mexican cinema with those 3 filmmakers, and how influential was for you, and what's your take on that? Whoever wants to jump in.
Well, they do make Mexican films, at least Cuarón did, and I wanted just to say that a great thing about Mexican film funds is that you can make the films you are passionate about because you're not thinking about the audience and you have no censorship. And I believe partly that's why Cuarón went back to Mexico to make this different film that is Roma, and he financed that film partially with the tax incentive fund. So I just wanted to say that even really established filmmakers go back to Mexico to get those funds.
And to tell also like Mexican stories. Like for example, I've heard that Iñárritu is back to Mexico and preparing something as well. So it's interesting that they are like trying to get back to Mexico and tell stories from there.
Yeah, I think Cuarón did that before with Y Tu Mamá También. He had already made this film, And Your Mother Too, with Gael Garcia and Diego Luna. It's from the year 2001 or something like that. But he had already emigrated to make films in the States, you know. Like, so I think he has been like doing Mexican films. I think a film like Roma benefits because it gives a lot of job to a lot of people in the film industry. I think a film as big as Roma helps with that, but I think for us, like the other directors, I don't see like more than the people have the notions that the Mexican can do Mexican like good films. It doesn't benefit us really so much, in my opinion.
I think their films were really important in order to kind of break away from our inherited melodrama, you know, from like soap opera culture, and also from our proximity to Hollywood and the Hollywood sort of formula of movies. They really did challenge kind of what we knew as storytelling and film craft itself. But I'm really eager to see new faces, and there are new faces, and there are very different filmmakers now, and I think it's time maybe for them to step back and support those filmmakers, or just so that they can get a better projection outside of Mexico as well.
Fernanda, we had a conversation a few weeks ago, and you mentioned something that I found very interesting, that the fact that a lot of independent or art house Mexican films don't really find an audience in the commercial circuit is sort of like a blessing and a curse, because you know, you clearly want your films to be seen, but at the same time, not having the commercial aspect be a big part of, you know, what you're making this film provides filmmakers with a certain kind of freedom. Could you expand on why you feel that's the case?
Yeah, I believe that's, I was saying just a few minutes ago, that our greatest challenge is distribution. So our films are not seen. The Mexican audience, they don't see a lot of Mexican films. And what that causes is that the filmmaking industry needs public funds, because then if you have an investor, they don't get any money back from that investment. So we depend completely on public funding. And the good thing about that, the good aspect, is that because you really don't have an investor that you have to answer to, then you just do whatever you want. And that makes you free. And of course, in the back of your mind, you're thinking about an audience, but it's perhaps what you would like to see as an audience, or perhaps film festivals, because I believe in the end many of us are doing festivals for an international audience. And it really is true that our films are going to be seen abroad much more than people are going to see them in Mexico.
Yeah, I would say that I think there is some films that Fernanda is right, of course, but some of this found that the private companies get to reduce tax donating money for cinema. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them, they ask for product placement as well, you know, like, so if some brand will give you some money, which is state money at the end, not private money, they will ask for some product placement on your film, you know, like, so I think that's not cool.
But I just have to stop you there, because about the tax incentive, it's not reduction, because the taxpayers, they don't get their taxes reducted, they don't get any discount. It's just a label. They decide that they can put a percentage of their taxes into a film. That's why it's difficult, because they don't gain anything by putting their taxes into films. their only advantage is to decide into which film. So I believe that's why they ask for product placements, and they don't see investing into art house films a good idea. For example, my film, it was really, really hard to find a taxpayer because he talks about violence and deaf people. And so where do you place a product there? And
Of course.
Do you want to say something?
But also, because I have get involved in distribution using the tax incentive in the distribution side, and it's very effective. I mean, it gives you a P&A to expend, but I think also what the challenge is, how can we construct campaigns to get close to the audience? Because now even it's cheaper, no? It's like you don't need like a billboard to get close to the audience. Now with Instagram, with Facebook, with like, there is a lot of advertisement who is more cheaper, but it's just the way how you want to show your movie, or what it's like, what you want to tell, or why the audience should watch your film, no? And that's, I think that's so many movies, and there are not many distributors who do that. That's why it's like, it's stuck, and the exhibitors are almost, it's like a monopoly. I think that's also the challenge. How can we get closer, like not spending that much money in a way?
I mean, so it seems like the reason for this wave or this advent of Mexican cinema is the tax incentive or this facility to access money to make movies. But then you have the other side of audience. So why is the Mexican audience so against watching Mexican films? Why is it so hard to get people to see the films once they're out there?
Well, it depends on which Mexican film, I guess. Right. Because, like, for example, the most popular comedies that produced in Mexico, they have a lot of people watching that. Like, for example, this film by Eugenio Derbez, it made 700 million. So that's like historically a lot, It's more like the art house films that the people don't like so much. And I guess it's because we in Mexico have this culture, like this culture in our bones of melodrama, of soap opera, So if you don't find that in the films, we are used to watch telenovelas, and at least my generation, we grew up watching telenovelas, soap operas. Actually, I think that's what we export a lot. Actually, I think there's some people in Serbia, once I was in Serbia, and some people speak Spanish because they watch the Mexican telenovelas and they know some words. So it's this culture that we have. So when you watch a film like, I haven't seen, but Fernanda, as she said, with violence and different topics and from a different angle, the people, I don't think they relate. Or a film like mine that there is no good and bad characters. The people, it's difficult for the general public with this culture to identify with that. I guess that would be my stab at it.
I have a slightly different opinion. I believe it's not that Mexican audience are against Mexican films, and we have to tell that it's really difficult to be right besides America, because it depends every year, but the second or third world consumer of American films. So we are competing against Hollywood films. So a film like ours, a really small film, we launch ourselves to compete against Avengers or Toy Story. So it's really difficult to place a film in the big theaters. And I do believe that the Mexican government and we, the industry, we should push to have protection for films. And I believe that's the next step to really make our industry strong, because now we are producing a lot. There are laws that help us produce, but there are not enough laws to help us distribute.
Yeah, I somewhat agree with Fernanda. I think it's not a question of liking, it's more like, how do you reach that audience? How do you frame the film for that audience? And how do you break the prejudices on behalf of the audience? And I think it takes a really long time, but I'm really optimistic. I think, with documentary festivals in Mexico 10 years ago, nobody they confused short films with documentary because somehow they did not belong to the feature film world. So that has changed significantly now, and you have, you know, at least 10 documentary film festivals now, and people watching documentaries in the cinemas, you know, as well as other platforms. So I think it's a long-term job that has to do with definitely bringing the films to those audiences, but also in terms of the campaign or how you reach them. How do you break with those prejudices? Because we did, I think, grow up thinking that everything coming from the US was better, and now that's also changing. I think your new president helped to change that. So now there's a lot of wanting to buy local, you know, everything rather than from the US. I think it's a good moment.
Yeah, and also there is not a formula. You know, like even commercial movies fail. No, like you don't really know the audience if it's gonna like or not your film. it's something. It's a real challenge. And also the Mexican law, in the cultural side, there is a little gap. So that's why our cinema is not protected. So that's why we need to work on that. Because I don't know, for example, in France, the French cinema, the national cinema is protected, so there are like even spaces, exhibition places that protect and that people can find. Because even in Mexico City, it's also very concentrated. So if you go to Monterrey or Guadalajara, it's also like a different challenge. And in Mexico City, there is an independent circuit, and people can find there. But we have also Cineteca, for example, the Cinematheque, and it's very successful. But we need to try to have more spaces and to have a new law that really protect our cinema, because it's federal money as well.
Elena, can you tell us a little bit about, I know that you sort of like left your leadership position at Ambulante a few years back, but you were there for 11 years and, you know, transformed sort of the landscape of how documentary is seen in Mexico. Why do you think that Ambulante was so successful in engaging audiences?
I think our starting point was precisely like, it's not that people don't like documentaries, it's that we're not making an effort to actively reach those audiences. You know, some audiences that had probably never even seen a documentary. So from the very first year, the festival was conceived as a traveling festival, but not only traveling films, but traveling with the films and then creating encounters with the audience, which is why I still think festivals will live hopefully forever, because it's very different watching a film, you know, alone in a screen, whereas you're watching them with other people and are able to relate to that film, and maybe the filmmaker and maybe the characters in the film are there. So I think those are very privileged spaces that move film forward, or, you know, even film language forward. I think it's a synergy, not just within kind of the film industry, but always in relation with the audience is what moves film forward. So I think in that regard, that was kind of the main goal of the festival, is find those audiences and then stay there, and then every year build from that, and also try and, you know, enter spaces that wouldn't necessarily be thought of as a space for film. So, you know, we would do screenings inside parking lots or inside bars, you know, and like set up a screen, or in the middle of a town, you know, in the highway on the way to a big city. So it was, I think that was the main drive. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to switch the topic to sort of, as you know, this rise of Mexican cinema and the production in the country happened, the country was also going through, you know, a very difficult time with the drug war, and, you know, the fact that they happened almost simultaneously, I feel like affected the type of stories that we've seen in recent years, you know, with Ellie and multiple other films that, you know, touch on that. How, you know, from your perspective, how much has the political situation in Mexico influenced, you know, the culture and particularly cinema?
Well, I'm going to take the word. I think in a production way, what it's really worrying, it's to get security for the shooting. You know, to be 100% that everyone, or like all the authorities will know that there is going to happen like a shooting, and that you will need to protect your crew and your cast and even your insurance. Now, it's like, I think that's the biggest challenge. And also, like, for foreign productions that come to Mexico, it's the first question is like, okay, but is it safe? Are we not gonna get killed? So I think it's not that way. It's not that extreme. No, of course there are like different areas, and it's not about Mexico. Like it's the main problem. There are like so many problems, but I think that's the principle. Like in a production, to be 100% sure that you're gonna be safe in a way to have private security and also to have like the authorities that take care of you.
But I believe it's in our minds, and many filmmakers have made stories about violence and migration and all that stuff because it's what we are living, and we have been living that for more than 12 years. And I have, not the exact moment, but around 2010, we were going to the Morelia Film Festival because we had a short film there. And I got lost on the highway, and I was born in a state that's really nearby Morelia, and suddenly I realized that we were in danger, that a truck had been had been blocking the road, and we were really scared. And for 20 minutes, we couldn't find our way, and I kind of realized that this is a different country. It's like all of a sudden we woke up in a different Mexico. Now I don't make road trips. I used to make a lot of road trips when I was a teenager, and now you can't. So of course that's in our minds, and of course that's why people are telling all those stories, and that's why I made this film, because I had the urgency. And one time a programmer asked me, why weren't we thinking about something else? And I believe many filmmakers think about something else, and we have, like Rodrigo, a family drama, and we have thrillers, and we have horror films and comedies, but you still have to think about that because that's what you encounter in your daily life.
Yeah, I would like to add something to this. Of course, I think we have that on our minds, and when they ask, like, why do you make a lot of narco films? It's like, because it's what's happening, you know? And that's I think it's pretty natural. But the thing is that we have two types of films, you know. It's the way you interpret that, you know. There is films that it's an apology to that, you know, like to drug lords, and they make them look so cool, and it's pretty. There is some film that it gets pretty ridiculous, you know, and there is some films that are critic about it, you know, like, so it's on our minds, but you decide what point of view you take to that, you know, to that violence and to that situation of the country, you know?
Fernanda, with your film in particular, identifying features which is within this realm of films that talk about the violence in Mexico, did it come from a place of responsibility or wanting to, you know, exercise something, or what was the sort of the inception of wanting to tell this story that fits within what's happening in Mexico?
I did kind of felt responsible to talk about that, because when I began writing that film, I had previously made a short film that has kind of the same story. We were dealing with a government that made a prohibition to talk about violence on news and on papers. They made a deal to not discuss violence because they felt like that was a way of diminishing the violence itself, and of course that didn't happen. And it came from there. And also I come from a state that expels a lot of young people. In Guanajuato, it's a beautiful place, but at the same time, it's a place that every year expels thousands of its young people that try to make their way into the US. So I wanted to talk about that.
I think this is a good moment to talk about Vivos, Elena, you know, which is about the students, the forestry students that disappear in Mexico, and sort of like looking at that from a new perspective. You want to tell us sort of like what was the approach for this documentary?
Sure. It's the film that's here at Sundance. It's premiering at 5:30. It's directed and produced by Ai Weiwei, and Daniela, my partner, and I came into the film as associate producers. But it's about the 43 students that disappeared in Iguala, and it's a portrait of their families and how they live that disappearance, and then how that kind of emotional and psychological condition relates to our society and our culture as a whole. No? And I think back to what Fernanda was saying is we do live in a state of constant fear, knowing that not only the government has been completely ineffective at dealing with the problem, but also couldn't care less. You know, that's the sense, you know, all of us as citizens get in Mexico. It's not just that they can't deal with it, it's they really don't care, or, you know, won't bother because it's just too big of a challenge. And I think the number of disappeared in Mexico has been increasing every day, very dramatically. And then we're, you know, losing also a lot of Mexicans in the US, a lot of families being separated. So I think that every Mexican film, or most of the films produced, do relate to that condition of how do you live with that disappearance and with that separation. Mm-hmm.
Edher, I Carry You With Me is a completely different sort of story. Do you feel like you gravitate towards, you know, those type of films now, so sort of like a break from the other type of films? Do you think about that when you're like, you know, looking for your next project?
Just like I started to feel this, like remembering like, oh, what is happening in the world? No, it's very bad. And I think that's why I Carry You With Me. I really love this film because it shows you a different face of Mexico, but it also tells the problematic that we have about migration, about also it's a relation between two men in the 90s, so it also shows a story that it was forbidden in a way, no? Of course, and it's a very different Mexico, and that's why I think I Carry You With Me is very interesting, because it's like American female director coming to Mexico and telling a story about Mexicans, no? And I think we have to stay positive. I mean, of course, we cannot deny and don't say, oh, it's nothing happening here, no? Because even during our pre-production, there was a kidnap of a location manager. No, I mean, it was an express kidnap, and it's something very confusing. But it's there, no? It's on your face, but also you cannot like live every day that because there are like so many stories, there are so many diverse people, no, who are living in the country, and that's why I Carry You With Me, even in the way that explores the narrative. And I think it's also very unique that the new filmmakers have, no, like how to tell the stories, no, not go to what is very like the misery, no, like to just expose the misery the way it is. It's just like to go and tell in a very interesting way how audience can look at, see your story, no?
Changing the conversation for Elena and Fernanda, I know that Mexican women in cinema have taken sort of like a stand following Me Too and these movements, and created sort of like a collective of women that's standing up for women in the film industry. If you want to tell us a little bit about that.
Well, like it's happening in the world, I believe we are now claiming a right to tell stories, and also to make the big decisions in telling those stories. And what we have done with my partners, with Astrid and with Diana and with some other female filmmakers, we are claiming the public funds, because many of us are originally writers or directors, and we were looking for big and established producers. And we kind of realized that we could claim the funds ourselves, and that's what we have been doing, and that makes all the difference, because if you are the boss, then there's no one telling you you shouldn't do this or you should do that, and that gives you an incredible freedom. And a lot of colleagues, female colleagues, have been doing that. They have their own production companies, and I believe that's the key to freedom and to gender parity in terms of filmmaking.
Yeah, I would also add that there's a movement, Ya Es Hora, which got together following the Me Too, and they're not just kind of fighting for gender equality in the industry, but they've also developed like a protocol for film shoots that they're getting different production companies to to adopt. So that's one thing that's happening right now. But also another thing that we're fighting for is also changing the narrative of the films. So focusing a lot on the storytelling and the content of films, and slowly working to change that as well. So yeah, it's a good moment now.
Rodrigo and Fernanda, this is your first feature that you're premiering here as directors. Do you, in your process of making short films and sort of like entering the industry, do you feel that there's a community of filmmakers in Mexico, that there's sort of like, you know, a collective of filmmakers in general making projects and working on each other projects and sort of like that way supporting the new voices that are coming out of Mexico?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, I think. I mean, there is a lot of community. We come from the same film school, as I said before. It's named Centro de Capacitación Cinematográfica, which is like one of the film schools in Mexico City. And I think like the best thing to be like in a film school, I think it's not the only path to make films, but the best thing you get from there is that you make a community, you know, and not just that. I think that transcends the school, and I think in Mexico there is a lot of people eager to do things and to do films, and I'm really optimistic about that. You know, I think there is a lot of people in Mexico doing film, different type of film, and I really think that's cracking.
I do believe there's a community, and I think the best thing about it is that we have realized that we are not competing against each other. I'm not competing against my fellow director or my fellow writer, and we kind of help each other, and that's good, and I believe we support each other. And I just want to say something. In Mexico, one of the best things we have in filmmaking is that we have 2 public schools in Mexico. So it's really affordable to get into filmmaking, and that also makes the community more diverse, because it's not about high-class people making films. Because, for example, Centro de Capacitación Cinematográfica, you pay around $1,000 a year. So, and in return, they give you the money to make your films. So you receive much more than you actually pay for your fee. And it really makes all the difference. The UNAM, the QUEC, you pay nothing, absolutely nothing. And public education, I believe it's also the key, that our community, it's more diverse, and that's why so many filmmakers are telling different stories, because we have different backgrounds.
This is, I mean, not specific to your films, but in general, I felt like something that has happened in Mexican cinema or through Mexican cinema recently. It's the fact that a movie like Roma with Yalitza Aparicio brought to the table, you know, the racism that exists in Mexico against indigenous people. And I feel like, you know, because that movie was such an event, it got the attention, even though this problem has always existed across Mexico. Do any of you have any opinions on how cinema is, you know, an agent of change in terms of, you know, like you were saying, democratizing who gets to make movies and would stories get told in cinema?
Of course, films change us, and I believe each one of us can remember the films that really touched you when you were, I don't know, 10, 12, 15, and made you change your opinion about something. And I believe, of course, as more diverse people go into filmmaking, then we will have more diverse stories that will change the shape of the world, perhaps not itself, but of our ideas and thoughts about the world. What is ironic about Roma is that it's a film that features an indigenous woman, but it's made by a white male of a high-class society in Mexico. So, I mean, it's good that he talked about that, but it's gonna change really when an indigenous woman from a really low background makes a film about herself. That's going to be the change, I believe.
Yeah, I completely agree with Fernanda. And I think it has to do with not just giving them voices, but allowing their subjectivity, you know, whether behind the cameras or in front of the cameras. And I also think that films change perceptions, and if they change perception, then it's a step closer to changing behaviors and changing communities. So I think one very powerful element of film is also creating empathy and being able to connect very different lives, through one film. So
Do you feel like in documentary it happens more often than in fiction, that those stories get told?
I don't know if now. I think now there's a lot of crossover, and I think that's really interesting. But I definitely do think that in documentary it happens, historically a lot more than in fiction.
I also want to add that I think now the new government is giving a voice to the indigenous people. And also, it's something to learn about that there are so many other languages than Spanish in Mexico that we don't know and we should speak because it's like original language. And for example, now there is a filmmaker that I think is very talented. Her name is Angeles Cruz. And she made her first film, but she comes from Oaxaca. She speaks Zapotec. I think it's also interesting that female directors, but indigenous also, can bring very different stories, no? Stories that are not like in the city, that are from other villages, no? Other communities. And I think in the new wave, this new wave, there's going to be more. There's going to be more diversity also because of that.
Since we also want to touch on, how does the Mexican new wave reflects across Latin America, do you feel like other countries are looking at what's happening in Mexico in terms of funds and, sort of like this boom that it's having as a reference, perhaps you or Elena or Edher that produce films in other places?
Yeah, well, actually, the company that I did, I carry you with me, that I get involved, is called Zafiro Cinema. And we are very focused on co-producing with Latin America specifically. We have a new project now in Bolivia that they don't have funds. So it's like Mexico could construct a bridge, to bring some equipment. So because like in Latin America, there are very talented people, but they are not like technicians, for example. No, there is not like a sound mixer, like a DP, like a gaffer. So it's a very interesting way to collaborate if we can bring that to the South. Or for example, in Central America, now Guatemala has raised a lot, because now Jairo Bustamante, and also we did La Jaula de Oro, and I remember when we were there were just like 10 people, but now there are more. And now even the main characters of La Jaula de Oro, they are like still acting, they're still now doing like a gaffer work. It's very interesting, and I think we have Ibermedia, that is like this Ibero-American treaty, so we can co-produce between us, and it's a credit. So that could help because Mexico can be one of the third partners or maybe the two partners. And also through the tax incentives, and also the Foprocine is open to co-productions, even if the director is not Mexican. So it really helps, and I think that's the only way, because in Latin America we have so many similarities, and we should really be closer and together. And of course, they look at Mexico like the Mexican Hollywood, because we have, for example, like very good DPs, or very good art directors. So I think it's a time also to share and to construct stories.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more co-production that's very beneficial to both parties in terms of the funding you can access, but also I think in terms of shaping the film itself. Our first co-production was Midnight Family that premiered here last Sundance, and I think Luke, the director, and Kellen, one of their biggest concerns was that it didn't feel like a kind of foreign view on, a local problem, and for us that it didn't feel really local and, and not universal enough. So I think in this collaborative work, we did show the film to audiences, in the process of editing the film in the US and in Mexico, and that helped, their reactions helped shape the final film in a very significant way. So I think that's also an advantage to working together, beyond the economic, and I think, I agree with Edher.
Rodrigo and Fernanda, in conversations perhaps with filmmakers from other countries, do you find something that's specific about making films in Mexico that perhaps filmmakers in other countries don't understand or don't relate to in terms of how the system or sort of like, yeah, how it works to making a film in Mexico?
I don't know if I understood your question, but I guess it depends on, like, for example, I think I haven't worked in the film outside of Mexico, now that you say it, but
I mean, like, do you find that there's something unique about working in Mexico in conversations with other filmmakers, perhaps?
I think it's more, at least compared to the United States, for example. I think the production it's more free, you know. Like, you don't have a lot of. I think here, like the time schedule and everything's really marked. The unions really work. In Mexico, you can do things that I don't know if you can pull off in other countries, really, to tell you the truth. And but I'm not sure. I guess Edher is right when what we were saying about like the technical thing. Like in Mexico, we tend to be really technical, compared, I guess, to the other countries in Latin America, which they are really creative. But we're really technical. But I guess I'll say it's the freedom. If I would say that, I'm not an expert on that, but I guess that would be it.
I also believe that the public funds, it's really, like we were discussing at the beginning, something that has made Mexican film industry flourish. Because you can claim the fund yourself. You don't need, like I said, a big producer or a big company, and that makes you free. And the difference with filmmakers from other countries is like, perhaps if they come from a country where the industry is not so developed, like other Latin American countries or countries perhaps in Africa or Asia or East Europe, they have to make a really, really lengthy round of film grants and film funds. And after a year or two, perhaps they would raise half of what we can claim in a year in Mexico. So it really makes us fortunate to have those funds.
One of the problems that here in the United States, you know, people from a Latino background or Mexican Americans don't get to tell stories because there's no funds like that here for independent cinema. So for you, Elena and Edher, have you encountered anyone that perhaps wants to make a film in Mexico and, like, you know, use those funds back home that perhaps has a, you know, Mexican heritage or and wants to use those funds that are not available here? Because I feel like that there's a big gap in the stories that are told about the Mexican American community in the U.S.
Well, also I don't know, well, once someone contacted me and it was like, because there is also like the Pocho community, well, not the Pocho,
Chicano.
the Latinos that were born in the States, but has all like they're Pochos, well, that's the way we call
Chicanos.
each other. Chicanos, yeah, Chicanos. So I think also Chicanos has so many stories because there are also the stories from the borders. No, and we have I don't know, it's very interesting. Actually, I was in Juarez like a month ago, and also there are like also filmmakers there that want to tell stories, and it's like, hey, but I have a friend that is on the other side, and we have a script each other, and it's also, but they are a bit far because as I told you, in Mexico City it is where is based the fund. Well, the main companies has their offices. But I think also the IMCINE has been a lot, the Mexican Film Institute has been a lot of effort to go and bring and give talks about how the funds work, no? So also they can like know how to do it, because it's not about the story, it's how you present the story to the funds, no? Because the funds evaluate if the story is really good or not, because, you know, like everyone can tell a story, but is that story good enough in a cinematic way? So I think that's what the rest of Mexico, or even like Mexicans in the States or Latinos in the States, how to know how to get close or like construct the formula or the structure how to get access to the funds, no?
But sorry, just to say something about that. Like you said before, Mexico is really open to co-productions. So if there's a filmmaker from another country who has a story, then you can talk to a production company in Mexico, and then you can find a way of co-finance the film with Mexican film funds, and that has happened before. There's a really emblematic case of a film named Gloria, and it's not Gloria of the Chilean director, but about Gloria Trevi, a Mexican singer, and it's
Directed by a European filmmaker, right?
a Swiss director who ironically liked very much this singer and wanted to make that in Mexico. And even though he was a European filmmaker, he found a way to make that film with Mexican funds.
Elena, were you involved in the 3-minute hug, Everardo Lopez's film? Would you think it's a really great case of like a film that works for Mexico and the US? It's a short film by Everardo Gonzalez that's on Netflix if you want to see it. Un abrazo de 3 minutos, the 3-minute hug. That's a beautiful film about, sort of the divide between the US and Mexico through the eyes of like families that are separated. You want to tell us a little about making that short?
Sure. It's a short that we had to shoot in one day because it was the day of this event that was organized by 2 different organizations in the border. From the Border Network of Human Rights with the Mexican police and the Border Patrol. So they basically opened up the border between El Paso and Ciudad Juarez so that families that had been, most of them separated for years and hadn't seen each other, could hug for 3 minutes. So they only had 3 minutes, and then, the next kind of batch of families came forward. So, and it just follows along from the preparations of the event, the moment, when they hug, and then it closes at dusk when they're kind of dismantling the event. And that film was born of a broader project that was 5 short films that are all on Netflix. And the idea was to tell stories about the relationship between Mexico and the US, but different stories that we hadn't seen before. So that was one, but we wanted to work with a Mexican filmmaker based in the US that had basically grown up in the US. So After the Raid is a film that we did with Rodrigo Ruiz, who is a Mexican living in the US for a really long time, and his whole filmmaking career is here. But they're all kind of stories about that relationship. And in the production, in the case of Rodrigo, we did have crew members from both sides. Like we had in 3 of the shorts, we had in the filmmaking teams talent on both sides of the border. So that was also like an important component of how we conceived the project. Mm-hmm.
Before we pass it to the audience, Fernanda and Rodrigo, just in a general sense, with making your first feature, what was sort of like the challenge that you discovered that perhaps making short films wasn't there? What was that, perhaps breaking point or really challenging thing that you figured out while making your feature? Well,
I think it's like a resistance race, It's more like I was used to making a short film. The longest shooting that I had before shooting this film was like 7 days or something. So you kind of manage that like emotionally and work-wise, but then like to be shooting for like 35 days, I think it's just like a matter of resistance. I think that the main difference. It's the time shooting. Talking about that, and creative-wise, is like to make it's like a broader picture, Like there is more things that can go wrong, But I was really looked after doing my film, so it was really enjoyable for me, Like I couldn't say like I was distressed or anything. When I used to imagine how would it be to make my first film, I think it was lighter than I thought,
I think in most film schools, they teach you to make short films. And so you learn to write, to summarize stories. And for me, it was a challenge to write something longer than 20 pages. And that, for me, that was, I believe, the greatest challenge, to accustom yourself not to try to finish the story before the 25th minute. But then in production-wise, I had produced another films before this one, so that was not really the challenge, but I believe the writing.
Elena, what can you tell us about a cop movie that's sort of in development?
I think that was a huge challenge for us because it was our first, well, it has a very large fictional component to it, so it was our first fiction film, and for Alonso it was his first documentary, so we were kind of all in a very uncomfortable position throughout. But I think the challenge was, we first shot the documentary and then based on the documentary footage, and especially we edited kind of a radio cut with the audio of the documentary, and then that became the basis of the fictional script. So it was a really interesting process, but also full of uncertainty to a certain extent. And now the huge challenge is being the editing, how to combine both worlds in a seamless way that manages to transmit what it's like to be a police officer in Mexico today. So that's our challenge now.
Edher, for you, Carry You With Me sort of like has a very long timeline for these characters. What was the challenge in that?
Well, the challenge was, I think it was the casting. I think the casting process was very difficult, especially because Haiti has, I think she's really talented, and she was really trying to find the couple that could really match, and that was very difficult. So it was funny that if you meet some actor, it was like, hey, do you know if someone like get the part? Because it, like the casting, like all the guys with that profile did a casting. So I think that was very challenging, and I don't know. I think the real challenge is to don't stop believing the project and believe in your director. And I think that's something that it didn't happen in I Carry You With Me, because I don't know. It was different. It was difficult to understand Haiti sometimes, like the structure, because it's like a landscape. So there are certain parts that are memories, and some other is like fiction. So it was a bit difficult, but it's just the trust that you have to have. It's like a marriage.
So that's all the time we have, but before we go, I want each of you to remind us the title of your film playing at Sundance and when is it playing so people can see them. Rodrigo?
Well, my film is named Blanco de Verano, Summer White in English. It's in the World Cinema Dramatic. The first screening is on Sunday at 5:30, but it's going to be playing around. It would be really nice if you can come and watch the film.
My film is Identifying Features. In Spanish is Sin Señas Particulares. It's going to screen tomorrow at 5:30, and then some other days, the 26th, 27th, 31st, and 1st. But I don't remember the exact times.
So the film is Vivos. It's screening today at 5:30 at the Mark, then tomorrow at 8:30 in the morning, and then there's, I think, another screening tomorrow, and then one in Salt Lake City on February 1st or 2nd. So.
Our film is Te Llevo Conmigo, I Carry You With Me, and it's gonna be on Sunday, the first screening at midday at the library theater, and we're gonna have like 5 screenings, so you can check it on the website. I Carry You With Me.
Thank you so much, guys, for being here.
Thank you, Carlos.